Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. This first verse in the book of Jonah tells us that we're dealing with a historical person and a historical narrative. We're told right away that this is Jonah, the son of Amittai or Amittai. As we've seen, Jonah is referenced in the second book of Kings, chapter 14, and set directly in a historical time period with verse 23. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria, and reigned 41 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. He restored the territory of Israel from the entrance of Hamath to the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he had spoken through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-hepher. One more interesting note there, Gath-hepher is in Zebulun. And so this makes Jonah a man from Galilee. And as we will see throughout this book, he's representing Israel, the servant who fails to take the word to the nations, to take dominion over the world, and to be a light to the nations. And at one point, he's also going to represent the true servant Israel, who of course is Jesus. We've seen many cross ties between Jonah, Hosea, Amos, and Isaiah, for instance, and there are many more in other prophets as well, but those ones are in view right now. In Isaiah 9, which is the great prophecy of Jesus' coming, the child is born chapter, we find this, chapter 9, verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. Later in Isaiah, we will find out that his servant will be a light to all the nations, the Gentiles as well as the Jews. Here we see that light is coming from Zebulun, which is in Galilee. Jesus, of course, is pointed to in Matthew as coming from this land, and this very verse is cited. Jonah, the son of Amittai, is from Zebulun himself, so he's foreshadowing and being a type of Christ even in this. Interestingly enough, Isaiah 9 continues on to talk about the sins of Israel. He speaks of Ephraim, the inhabitants of Samaria, Manasseh, and even Judah. And he talks about raising up adversaries against them, the Syrians of the east and the Philistines on the west. He's condemning them in verse 9 for the pride and arrogance of their heart. The Lord has sent a word against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel. And all the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, who say in pride and in arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen, but we will build with dressed stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will put cedars in their place. The great sin is their pride. They're turning away from God. We see this represented as it will come up in the book of Jonah very soon. In verse 13 of Isaiah 9, we see, the people did not turn to him who struck them, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts. Their sin is turning away from him, in their own pride, in their own arrogance, or to other nations. And their sin manifest in their turning away from God continues when they will not turn back to him. Verse 13 says, they did not turn back to him who struck them, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts. Jonah starts with the phrase, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, or and the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai. This is actually a standard way of starting the books. Ruth starts with this, as does 2 Samuel. Interestingly for me, when Abraham is called in Genesis 12, this is the phrase that's used, and he's told to get up and leave the land of idolatry, the land of his father and his countrymen, and go to the promised land where God is going to take him and bless him. In Jonah, he's going the other way. We get the same phrase, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, but he says, now, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. So Jonah's going the other way. Israel has always been intended to be a light for the nations in Israel, but they've also been expected to go to and light the path for the Gentiles. Elijah is the only prophet we see who went to the Gentiles, but Jonah is the only one going with a curse to them. God tells him to arise and go to Nineveh, that great city. Nineveh was the greatest city of the world at that point. They were just off the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. Nineveh was founded in Genesis by Nimrod, who also founded the city of Babel. This may or may not be Babylon. The words are actually not derived from the same roots, so it's not necessary that Babel and Babylon are the same, but they are both in Shinar and are both referred to as Shinar. So there's a good chance that Nimrod has founded both Nineveh and Babylon, these two great competing empires. Assyria is the superpower of the world at the time, and Nineveh is the biggest, greatest city in Assyria, and it's their capital. It's also the most evil city, with the entire book of Nahum written as a condemnation of their evil. And this is where Jonah is being called to go. A city that is suppressing Israel, that has put their rulers under their thumb, extracted tribute for the right to live, and been a threat to their very existence. In fact, the prophecies of his day tell us that this east wind of Nineveh is going to come and destroy Israel, and now he's told to go and prophesy against them. God says that their evil has come up before me. This is very similar to what he told Abraham just before he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The word of their evil had come to him, and he was coming down to see if it was exactly that bad and if Sodom and Gomorrah needed to be destroyed. Similarly, in the incident of the Tower of Babel, again tying us back to Nimrod, God came down to see what they were up to with their tower. It was supposed to be so high and so proud that it was reaching to heaven, but God had to come down to look at it in this figurative language. In verse 3, Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Instead of going to Nineveh as commanded, he went the other way. He went down to Joppa, which is a city on the coast. This is the city that Peter was called to when Tabitha Dorcas had passed away, and the saints were mourning her and asked him to come. He actually resurrected Tabitha or Dorcas there at Joppa, and now we see it as a central port in this story of resurrection of Jonah. There's a lot of talk of Tarshish. Nobody knows exactly where it is. One of the things that pastors do is speak very authoritatively on different items of supposed fact that just come to us through Christian discussion and through other sermons. It's stated as fact in some commentaries and sermons that Tarshish is identified with Tartessos, an ancient region in Spain, but we have actually no way of knowing that. It's also been identified with various places, whether in Britain, Lebanon, Cyprus, or even in the Far East. One thing that makes me relate Tarshish to the Far East is that when Solomon and then Jehoshaphat built their ships of Tarshish, they built them on the Gulf of Aqaba, which is far inland even of the Gulf of Suez. And these ships could be wrecked in the Red Sea rather than the Mediterranean. When they traveled, they brought goods that were coming from India, and the gold from Ophir is found on the south end of the Red Sea. So many of these things point us not to the far west, but to the east when we speak of Tarshish. Most people will tell you that ships of Tarshish no longer mean ships that are going directly to a city called Tarshish, but that it means ships that are built for great voyages, or ships that are built to go on long trips to gather treasures. Nonetheless, that's where Jonah is intending to go. When people go to Jerusalem, they're told to go up to God. When we think of up, we think of north on a map. But they were going up to Jerusalem because topographically it was on a high land. It was on the mountains that were raised up from the Jordan Valley and from the Shephelah. Here we see that Jonah is going down. He's not going up to the Lord, but he's going down. Every manner of his direction is down. He rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. And then, in fact, when he's hurled into the sea, he goes down into the sea. His whole voyage, once he turns away from God, is downward. He's decided to go from the presence of the Lord. Of course, we know how silly this is because God is everywhere. You can't go up to heaven or down to Sheol or down to the depths of the sea and escape God's presence. So Jonah is not going to get away from him. But the idea that he can get away from him is his sin. We've seen this as well with Adam and Eve. When they sinned and they were afraid, they hid themselves from God. When Jonah didn't want to obey God, he tried to hide himself from the presence. He fled from God. This, for me, is one of the great lessons of our prayer life. When we're sinning or we feel distant from God, the worst thing we can do is turn our backs and try to avoid him. We don't feel like praying, and we don't feel like reading the Bible. We don't want to be convicted, or we don't want to be brought under the condemnation of our conscience. So we turn away from God. We create our own distance, and we sin more and more by doing so. What we need to do is turn and flee to God. When we sin, go to Him. When we feel distant, go to Him. God is always waiting for us. That's the book of Jonah. God is merciful, and He's pursuing us. He's reaching for us, and He's waiting for us to come back. So much of the book is related to the prodigal son, and when the prodigal son returns to God, the Father in the story, he isn't out working and busy doing something else. He's actually watching for his son to return. He sees him from a great distance, and he hikes up his skirts and he runs to him. That's what God does for us. He wants us with Him. He calls to us, and He reaches for us. In fact, in Reformed theology, He's the one who brings us to Him. So repeatedly we see what Jonah is doing wrong. He disobeys God right away. His disobedience is reflected in his attempt to flee from Him. In verse 3, he flees to Tarshish. It's stated twice in verse 3 that he's trying to flee from the presence of the Lord, which of course is a fool's errand and can never be done. We don't know what direction necessarily he's going on his trip to Tarshish, but we know he's gone so far in the opposite direction of Nineveh when he went to Joppa. He was supposed to go east, and he's gone west. Whether this ship of Tarshish is supposed to take him further west or not, we don't know, and it's not necessary, although people love to say it in a sermon to make it sound like he's going totally the opposite direction of what God has said. Indeed, he is going the opposite direction. He's going away from God. All the prophecies in Isaiah and Hosea have talked about how our sin is to turn away from God. In fact, Hosea 7, which we've pointed out before, where we find out that Ephraim is a dove. Ephraim is like a Jonah, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt and going to Assyria. We see right before that verse 11 in chapter 7:10, the pride of Israel testifies to his face, yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek Him for all this. This is the problem, is not seeking God. In fact, doing the opposite. Instead of drinking living water from His well, we go to our cracked and dried cisterns and try to drink the water that we can draw up ourselves.